Hello everyone, and welcome back to Obscure PS2 Games. It's been a while, but it's time for us to delve once again into the PS2's wonderfully weird and seemingly never-ending library of games.
Stretch panic!
It's easy to forget nowadays that games used to come bundled with manuals that you were expected to read. If you're too lazy to read though, or simply bought the game without a manual, you'd usually get along just fine using the in-game tutorials that were becoming more commonplace during this era. What if I told you though that there was a game that was completely incomprehensible in both story and gameplay without it? I introduce you to Treasure's Hippa, also known as Stretch Panic in the US or Freak Out in PAL regions. The opening cutscene is vague and doesn't make much sense, and then you're thrown into this strange, sketchy world that resembles the Take On Me music video. Your objective is not explained. Absolutely nothing is explained. This was quite a shock to me because I usually play a bit of a game before I go and read the manual. It usually isn't a mandatory task that precedes accessing the first level, that's for sure. Not that I'm complaining though. I was immediately hit with a bizarre, dreamlike quality that very much reminded me of what it was like playing Nights into Dreams for the very first time. So the opening makes sense in conjunction with the story outline from the manual. You play as the titular Linda, a girl who lives with 12 extremely vain sisters. One day, a mysterious doorway is delivered to their house that beckons them to a strange other world. Here they turn into monstrous, parodic versions of themselves that are corrupted by their vanity. It's up to Linda to go in and save them using her demon scarf that likes stretching things. You're able to control it with the right analog stick while you control Linda with the left. It shoots forward to grab things, and this is how you do damage to enemies. You have what's called a stretchometer. The longer you hold onto an enemy and stretch them, the higher it goes. You can release at any time to perform a snap attack, and this will do more damage the higher the stretchometer is. However, if the meter goes all the way into the red, you'll perform a torpedo attack for big damage. The stretchometer actually fills up quicker the faster you shake the right analog stick. The mechanics are all excellent and feel a bit ahead of their time in a lot of ways. I can really see this gameplay style being used in a Wii game or something. Usually games that have had rushed developments show it with bad gameplay. Hippa is a rare example where this is shown not by what's in the game, which is all good, but by what's not in there. You see, this game is almost entirely a boss rush. Linda has to save all 12 of her sisters by exercising them. And that's all of the game, pretty much. The only non-boss levels come in the form of the 4 EX worlds. These are populated by a single enemy type, the Bonita Zaccos. They have a giant set of tits, as you can see. There's a reason for this though, they're demons of vanity after all. You can explain that to whoever catches you playing this. I'm sure they'll find it as interesting as I did. These are really cool enemies, but again, they're the only regular enemy in the entire game. Call it quality over quantity if you want. The EX worlds are small and aren't fully fleshed out levels in the traditional sense. They only exist so you can farm points that can be used to unlock boss doors, which is where the game truly shines. They're all extremely creative treats for anyone who is a fan of boss fights. The manual goes into more detail about why they look the way they do and what it says about their personality. Jelly-chan is a glutton, so is transformed into a big blob of jelly. Miss Mecha wanted to become an inventor, so she's piloting a giant robot. Siren wanted to become an opera singer, so she's able to use her singing to transform herself and the little Zaccos around her into demons. These bosses use the mechanics to great effect for the most part. Every part of them is stretchable. You can really tell that this was the technology they sold the game on. It still holds up pretty well. You can also grab objects and throw them, like Jelly-chan's eyeballs and the little Zaccos. This is the most underutilized part of the gameplay. I can't recall any instance where throwing objects does anything useful. Occasionally you'll need to grab the Zaccos though, like during the Cyan boss fight to make her vulnerable to your attacks. This is one of the more challenging bosses since it's the only one that forces you to use a jump feature. This is where you grab a surface and click in the right stick. You use it a little in the X-Worlds, but almost never in the bosses. My absolute favourite boss in this game is Demonica, not the one from Strange Journey. She's a fan of horror movies, so takes an unspeakable form so terrifying that if Linda even looks at her, it's game over. You have to keep her from entering the room by grabbing the door she tries to enter. Now let's get to the huge beginner's trap for people who didn't read the manual. Defeating the bosses normally is not enough to actually beat the game. You also need to exercise them using the Scarf Bomb, which is done by holding down both L3 and R3 and grabbing hold of the boss for around 5 seconds. You know you've done it correctly when you see this weird demon thing flying around the boss arena. At this point you're free to win the fight normally. The idea behind this mechanic is that you need to wait for the right opportunity to use it. There are certain critical spots you can hit that will stun them for a bit. It's kind of a brainless process though if you ask me. You can just about activate it whenever and chances are it will be successful. It costs 5 points to use, so you need to do a bit of grinding in the X-Worlds to actually beat the game. This does feel like something they've put in here just to pad out its meagre 3 to 4 hour runtime. It's a short experience, but it's a great one, typical of Treasure's games. My only real complaint is that I think the lock-on button should have a toggle since you're holding it down through every boss fight most of the time. A hard mode would have also been nice since it's a little on the easy side. Wonderful game though. Great aesthetics, great music, great gameplay. It's just a shame it isn't longer and more fleshed out. There's a foundation here that they could have built on for sequels, but alas, that was never meant to be. Mobile Suit Gundam 1 Year War, developed by Namco. I first became aware of this particular Gundam game when it came highly recommended by longtime subscriber and friend of mine, Kandriad, who says it's his favourite Gundam game. There was also something of a mystique surrounding it since I watched him try to beat it a number of times on PCSX2 to no avail. The game will always freeze on Mission 26, Cosmic Glow, specifically when you're fighting Lalah piloting the Elmeth. It can happen when you're dealing damage to her, it can happen when you're receiving damage from her, it can happen when you're avoiding her entirely. It does not matter, the crash is inevitable. It's particularly bad when it freezes on this still of Lalah screaming, like some kind of bad creepypasta. This is an issue that very few people online have ever mentioned, let alone fixed. There's this forum post by user Footjob Shoei who claims to have fixed it by using another Japanese BIOS. But none of the ones we tried fixed the issue. Determined and desperate to find some kind of workaround, we set about trying every single PS2 BIOS that has ever existed.
No! Alright, let's try that again.
It was all fruitless. Not one time were we able to get past what we dubbed as the Lalah curse. I'm usually complaining about how often I see Lalah die in these 0079 games, and here I was absolutely determined to put this bitch in the ground. Was Footjob Shoei telling fibs? Did he go online just to lie about this extremely specific issue in a game very few people know or care about? That's right, Footjob Shoei, I'm calling you out. There's no way you beat this game on PCSX2. At this point I was so invested in seeing the end of this stupid mission I just straight up bought a copy off eBay. Alternatively, you could probably play the game through OpenPS2 Loader. But the fact of the matter is, you're not getting past the Lalah curse with our actual PS2 hardware. If you do find a workaround, drop a comment below. I'm sure Kandriad will be very grateful for the information. Anyway, let's actually talk about the game itself. It's one of the many adaptations of the original Gundam to a game format. It's not even the first one to be featured in obscure PS2 games. You're able to freely aim in this one with some assist, as opposed to the rigid lock-on systems that these games typically have. It makes this one a bit more involving since you actually have to get a visual on your enemy. It does have one of my biggest pet peeves with Gundam games from this era though. Iframes for enemy mobile suits. This never fails to drive me nuts. You frequently stun enemies with your beam rifle, which seems like a great opportunity to go in for a melee attack. But since they have iframes, you'll probably be the one taking damage. Terrible, terrible design decision. Ships are also a bit annoying to destroy since you need to shoot all of their weak spots before you're allowed to do any real damage. The gameplay has a lot of awesome aspects though, like being able to shoot down incoming missiles with the head Vulcans. The melee, when successful, is incredibly satisfying. You might be tempted to defeat enemies in the same way as Amuro does in the original show. This is something the developers thought of because you're rewarded for doing it with the Memorial Moments feature. The movement is okay, but it's far from perfect. For example, if you let go of the stick, you have to wait for a short stopping animation to finish before you can move again. And I really wish you could move the camera quicker. It's far too slow for close quarters combat. Although the aim assist does a good job of accommodating. Occasionally, the campaign throws a curveball to break things up. There's a couple of okay turret sections. And this incredibly bizarre mission where it turns into an on-rails first-person shooter. Ah yes, you can forget the iconic moment from the original show when Amuro shoots like 100 Zeon soldiers with a pistol on board White Base. The models here look really good. You can definitely tell it was a late PS2 title, that's for sure. This might be the most detailed pistol of the 6th generation. This might be the best looking moon of the 6th generation. This might be the best looking Sailor Mass and Sailor Mass Camel Toe of the 6th generation. The final mission turns the famous last shooting into a QTE, the only one in the entire game, and if you fail it, you have to do the entire mission again. I found this out the hard way because I was kind of looking down at my phone when it happened. This isn't my favourite Gundam game if you couldn't tell. I'm not a fan of how little boost you have to work with or how dodgy the enemies are. It became too samey by the end for my liking. It has no English translation, but it's extremely easy to pick up and play without it. The only thing you're missing is the story, but if you're playing this game, you probably already know what it is. Of course, this only goes for people who bought a physical copy. The aforementioned emulator issue will make sure you'll see the ending no other way. Lalah Soon is not a fan of video game piracy, it seems. Simple 2000 Series Ultimate Volume 28, Bosu Kenka Grand Prix Drive to Survive. I played this one because it was a Simple 2000s game, only to find that it's actually just the Japanese version of a British game called Mashed Fully Loaded. It's by the same devs as some of the old Micro Machines games. What a fool I've been. I could have just played the PAL version with the English menu instead. That's what I would have said if this version didn't bless me with funny Japanese voice acting that sounds like it was recorded over a Discord voice chat. Your opponents never seem to stop yapping. Anyway, this is a pretty fun game to get a few laughs out of. There are regular races where you have to come in first place, of course, but most of the time you have these points-based races where you can either race ahead of the other drivers or trash them with weapons. Sometimes the AI just drives themselves into oblivion and you win without doing anything.
Don't move.
I had no choice.
I'm with the...
Special Marine Forces Recon, I know. You're here to scout the facility, but you're too late.
Extermination was an early attempt to bring the survival horror genre to the PS2. About 6 months before Silent Hill 2 came along. It was created by Deep Space, a developer that only made this and one other game. There's some recognizable names in the credits to those with a discerning eye, like the game's scenario writer and planner, SWERY. This is an interesting title because it's one I've seen almost no one talk about. That's not too surprising though. It didn't break any new ground when it was released in 2001. Reviewers weren't particularly impressed with it, and it was quickly swept under the rug in the wake of the golden age of survival horror games that would immediately follow. But I think it's pretty solid for what it is. You can certainly do much worse, especially in this genre. You play as US Marine Dennis Riley, who is sent on a mission to a base in Antarctica following a distress call. He arrives to find that the entire facility has been overrun by a deadly bacteria that turns people into monsters. You have an infection meter that goes up whenever you're hit with this green liquid that the enemies spit. If it gets to 100%, you become infected and have to race to the nearest MTS bed to cure yourself of a vaccine. Infection lowers your maximum HP and will continue to drain it until you die. With this being a survival horror game, resources are scarce. Vaccines and regular health items are plentiful, but finite. Your main weapon uses ammo that can be infinitely restocked at certain locations, so at least you're free to kill all the enemies that you come across. The only ammo types that are limited are the ones for your other weapons, which come in the form of attachments for your rifle. Customizing your rifle is one of the unique aspects of this game. There's a bunch of different scopes for different things. For example, you can change to a scope that has better aim assist in first person, or to one that has night vision for getting through dark areas. It's all about choosing the right equipment for the job. I enjoyed this mechanic at first, but after a while I realised that it overcomplicates something that should be simple. In Resident Evil, if you want to equip a gun, you just equip the gun. But here you have to go in this menu and try to remember which of these sub-menus actually changes your weapon attachment. Scope mount is obvious, but what is URS? What does selector entail? Are MA components what I'm looking for? I think it probably is. This is a puzzle I had to solve over and over again every time I went in this menu. To make matters worse, equipping some parts unequips other parts. Your weapon attachments are in the lower URS menu, except for the rocket launcher, which is in the MA components instead. A little simplicity would have been nice. Towards the end of this game, I had so many parts it just became cumbersome to deal with. I was often in the menu during boss fights more than actually fighting them. A lot of it is relatively straightforward though and doesn't need tinkering with. Your rifle starts out with single shot fire until you get free burst fire and then finally full auto. There's no reason to look back once that's upgraded. Throughout the game, you find extra magazines that allow you to carry a higher maximum ammo count. It goes well into the hundreds after a while. These are missable and not necessary for completion, but they're nice to have. It's not something revealed in the manual or the game itself, but you're able to manually reload your gun by clicking the left stick. This knowledge greatly improves quality of life. I had this entire section written complaining about how you're not able to manually reload, but it is in there. Movement is alright when you're not accidentally jumping to your death, which is quite easy. The camera is really annoying since the only way you can move it is to stop and aim your gun. If you can get past these things though, the gameplay is very solid. There's some light puzzle solving and platforming that doesn't detract too much from the core experience, which I found to be mostly action oriented. It doesn't feel like it fully commits to the horror aspect. The creatures are pretty forgettable. They're generic video game enemies with big obvious weak spots. Certainly not something I'm going to be having nightmares about. This corridor where you first encounter the dog monsters is the closest the game got to making me jump. Once the enemies start shooting you with guns though, it's all over. They just become tedious obstacles to deal with. These guys are either certain death or really easy to cheese from far away. There is no in between. I really like that even the puddles could attack you since the bacteria can take control of water. It's just a shame the game doesn't do much with it. The game flirts with the idea of limited saves but doesn't go all the way. You carry around a battery with a limited charge that can be used to record your progress on these machines. It's kinda like the RE ink ribbons. But it gets undermined by the presence of infinite battery recharging stations. At the very least, these sometimes require you to do a bit of backtracking. But you know the game's truly given up when the infinite recharging station is placed right next to the save point. Alright, you might as well just let me save like a normal game at this point.
Excellent! A perfect shot of our hero who destroyed the monster.
The story is nothing to write home about. This may be a SWERY joint, but it doesn't have his wonderfully bizarre writing. At the very least, it doesn't have his trademark jank or technical incompetence either, so pick your poison, I guess. I think they may have accidentally left that part in Japanese. This is another game that is very different depending on the region you play it in. The US and PAL versions have completely different English dubs for some reason. The PAL version retains the original Japanese character design of Dennis, while the US version changes it completely, turning him into some sort of bootleg Raiden. Even his voice kinda sounds like him.
Let's blow those bastards to hell.
The US voice acting is very bad and robs poor Dennis of all the badassery he's meant to have. He sounds way better in the PAL version, where his voice is deeper and his performance is more natural.
I would have been chop suey, right? Yada yada yada, I've heard it all before.
Believe it or not, these aren't the only differences. There's changes to the entire game balance. Ammo is doubled in the PAL version, and enemies take twice as many bullets. You'll notice that most of my footage comes from the US version though. That's the one I played, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe that was a mistake. Enemies taking twice as many bullets though, that just sounds annoying. The story that's there is perfectly serviceable, if a little uninspired, but the horrible voice acting in the US version makes it incredibly difficult to care about any of it.
We have to save them before we blast this place. That didn't sound too good.
It's also not the so bad it's good kind of bad voice acting either. It's just kind of boring to listen to. There's one more thing I have to complain about. The terrible final boss. For the most part, this is a relatively easy game that gives you more than enough ammo to get by. This goes out the window with the final boss, which you can easily screw yourself on if you don't collect the missable rocket launcher. It's a good job I had multiple save slots, or else I would have been stuck here. Even with my huge stockpile of ammo, it just wasn't enough to beat this boss without the rocket launcher. That's not even mentioning how annoying it is in other ways. If you play this game, do yourself a favour and look up how to find that rocket launcher. Few games have used the wonder of flight to convey a real sense of adventure quite like Sky Odyssey. This is an early PS2 release that has a unique take on the flight genre. There's no air combat to speak of. Rather, this is about boldly soaring through the open skies to lands unseen. This is established with its brief yet effective introduction. We're a daring explorer who must conquer 4 uncharted islands. Legend has it, there are 4 pieces of a map that will lead us to the hidden tower of Maximus. Not a single soul has lived to reveal its secrets. The only adversary that stands in our way is nature itself. Harsh weather and hostile terrain is a common obstacle in most missions. Rock slides and falling stalagmites will inexplicably follow your plane wherever it goes. These are more for show rather than something that's realistically going to hit you though. And there's also the inherent limitations of your aircraft itself. Some missions require mid-air refueling, or the complete opposite, dumping your fuel. My favourite moment comes when your engine burns out and you have to escape down a river on pontoons. It probably doesn't look like much just from the footage I'm showing, but trust me, it's exhilarating to play. These twists and turns in the middle of missions are never cheap. They don't require any kind of memorization or trial and error. The game instead expects you to act on the fly, as you would if you were really there. Crashing will likely lead to death, but it's no certainty. There were many close calls in my playthrough where I just narrowly managed to survive thanks to some quick thinking and, more importantly, my landing gear. The developers must have been aware of this because it's mentioned as a tactic in the manual. I love how this game feels and controls. You can feel the weight and lift of your aircraft. Because of this, it's immediately obvious when something is going wrong, like an unexpected stall caused by strong winds. You're able to customize your aircraft using parts that you can unlock from getting good ranks on missions, and these make a world of difference. You can gain speed at the expense of stability and vice versa. It's nice to have that extra control during missions that have you making tight turns inside tunnels. But speed mustn't be neglected. Most of the time it's useful for getting higher ranks for finishing quicker, but there are sections that are impossible to pass without good climbing ability. This happens during the game's final mission to the Tower of Maximus, which is an absolute gauntlet of a mission that puts all your skills to the test. It's a spectacular final that takes you on a journey through a lost civilization. And by the end I was just like, wow, what a great game. There's a quaint sentimentality to this game that feels both timeless and old-timey. This is something that's reflected in the playable aircraft you have available to you. Old planes from the first half of the 20th century. They're not even particularly famous picks either. The British Swordfish torpedo bomber is the one that's featured on the PAL cover, and is also the one that I found myself using throughout much of the game. It's not going to be setting any airspeed records, but it has great stability and holds up against even the harshest weather. You underestimate the Swordfish at your own peril. The Germans found that out the hard way when it sunk the Bismarck. Speaking of which, there's also the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which is better for missions where you need that extra speed. Unlike the default Swordfish, you're actually able to retract the landing gear with this one, but I kind of forgot and just flew with it out. Please don't make fun of my gameplay in the comments. And then there's this thing, the Pulse Jet, which I think is fictional. It's the fastest of the starter planes and the best pick if you want to speedrun to the end like a nutcase. Its greasy fast speed makes it a pain to land though. The same goes for the ME-262, which you unlock after beating the game for the first time, provided you were able to go over the mountain in the mission The Great Divide. Other unlockable aircraft includes the Corsair, the Shinden, that's the Godzilla -1 plane, and then some truly outlandish picks, like a Nighthawk stealth bomber and just straight up a UFO. Some of these are locked behind other modes, like Target, where you fly through targets, and Sky Canvas, where you play the role of a skywriter. I can definitely see myself doing multiple playthroughs of the main adventure. There's different ways of approaching the game that make it very replayable. I haven't even touched on the acrobatic points mechanic, which you gain by doing rolls and flying at low altitudes. It's an optional objective just in case you want to show off your skills. This also goes for those rings that you've been seeing me fly through, by the way. They're mainly there to stop you from veering too far off the beaten path, and to increase your rankings at the end of missions. They're not necessary to actually beat them though. I can assure you that Lex does not win if you miss one. There's a surprising amount of variety in the mission objectives themselves.
Your mission: find ruins on southern Arcadia Island. Land: recover a piece of the lost map. Weather is clear. Fly southeast. You will soon come to a winding gorge. Fly in this gorge until you come to a large waterfall.
Wait a minute, why does this guy's voice sound so familiar to me? I know I've heard it before. Anyway, the music is also quite charming. It was done by Ko Otani of Shadow of the Colossus fame. He did a great job at capturing the game's old-school adventure feel. At times, it evokes an old Hollywood picture. My favourite part of the soundtrack are the tracks that play during the mission briefings though. They sound like songs from the lost civilizations we're exploring. But they also sound like something out of Nier.
When finished refueling, fly away from train or press the circle button to detach.
I swear I've heard this guy's voice before. This is the mission briefing voice from the US version, by the way. The PAL version has a British woman doing the voiceover instead, and the original Japanese version has the legendary Makio Inoue, Captain Harlock himself. A lot of reviewers at the time dismissed this game because of its graphics, and indeed they do look rather PS1-esque. It's not impressive on that front, but I found it to be a very forgivable flaw. I mean, just look at that little town down there. It's adorable. You can really tell that the developers loved what they were making. There's a childlike wonder to this game that's hard not to love. Japanese creators occasionally lament that innocent sense of discovery that made early tales of aviation so inspiring. It was a time of pioneers and dreamers taking to the skies in search of new horizons. Oh, I know where I recognise that voice from now.
Dark Metamorphosis!
A special thank you to my channel members and patrons. I've been Sniggity Slice, I'll see you around.